Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Today we are recording from Astoria, Queens, Bellingham, Washington, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Our guest today is Rye Walker. Rye, introduce yourself.
Hi, good to chat with you, JD. Rye Walker, Cincinnati, CEO of Tembo.
Okay, and you're also a coder and an investor.
Yes, you
Okay,
must be looking at my LinkedIn profile or my Twitter
well,
profile.
my producer's notes really.
That,
Before we talk about Tembo, because there is interesting things happening there. Talk to me about
yeah,
how you're a coder and investor. That's a rare breed.
yeah. Well, basically, coders once you make a certain amount of money through an exit or whatnot, you have to figure out what to do with your money. So yeah, I had the fortunate experience during the pandemic of being a founder of a company called Astronomer that went raised $300 million during the big hype cycle that we were all just witnessing. I was able to sell a bunch of my shares in secondary, and yeah, I always start a company writing code, and then eventually you hire people and you don't get to write code anymore, and that's the cycle that I've probably gone through myself, probably 10 times in my life now. Where, but as of last summer, I was like happily full time. Before founding Tembo, I was working on a side project called OSS Rank, which is basically trying to index all the world's open source projects and the contributors, and trying to rank them against each other. I came up with an algorithm to do that, and that was just a solo project that I did in Ruby on Rails, just last year.
So who's number one
Oh gosh,
in the ranking? Not in
yeah,
favoritism, but in the ranking.
yeah. Let me see. I'm just gonna pull it up real quick because I don't have it memorized. But there are certain projects like this guy named Brian Chan from LifeRay, which I don't know if you ever heard of LifeRay portal. I had never heard of it. It's a digital experience platform, a DXP. But this guy has committed to that project 697. Well, no, wait, how many times did I say it? Yeah, 263,000 commits to this project. Can you believe that a
That's a
person has
lot.
committed? Yeah.
That's a
So
lot.
then the real question is like, is the guy, is he a robot or is he real? I don't know. I haven't like investigated everybody to find out if they're humans or a group of humans, but yeah, I mean, uh, that's insane. So that's number one. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say a group of humans. What a lot of people don't realize is there's certain cultures that actually do that, where there's a
Mm-hmm.
single person that is in front, that the face, but there's a team or 20 people behind them actually doing all the work. That
Yeah.
actually does happen.
Yeah.
Well,
I agree.
our theme today is Postgres and entrepreneurship. As I understand it, Tembo has a particular opinion between those two.
Yep.
What do you talk to me a little bit about that first?
About the opinion about what we're just basically what we're working on.
Yeah, yeah. What is Tembo?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does that all relate?
Yeah. So, I mean, Tembo is a managed Postgres. I know that there's 100 others out there already, but I actually think there's some interesting opportunities still in the market, including the idea that we should be able to, I think, install extensions easier and understand which extensions are high quality versus not high quality, or well used versus not very well used. There's not much data around that, and I think what happens is, like, if you look at a Postgres extension that is a little bit outside the box, it's pretty hard to pick it right now, versus going with a product that is dedicated to solving that problem, that extension solves. For example, let's take a column or table. There's various extensions that allow you to store data in Postgres as a columnar store. There's a few different variations of it. Someone's forked it, and it's like, oh, well, I'm just going to put my data in Snowflake. They do columnar data really well, and that's what's happening over and over. And I think it'd be kind of fun and a great world where Postgres won more of those competitions against the other data platforms. If it did that, it's great for me as a developer that I don't have to buy a bunch of tools, to do everything I want to do with my data. So that's kind of like level one of our first mission is like we're building a registry for extensions. We're building a CLI tool to easily install them. We're codifying all the weirdness, that may exist to install different extensions on different operating systems. And that's a lot of work, but the benefit to it is at the end of the day, in our platform, we'll have little switches that you can just turn on and turn off to put extensions on or off. So that's kind of the first thing we're working on, and that stuff's already available in our alpha platform.
Okay. I've got some thoughts on that, but I want to move down this a little bit and we'll get there.
Yeah.
So we got fundraising and entrepreneurship. We talked about your professional trajectory a little bit already. Is there any particular problems that you've like set out to solve? I mean, outside of just scratching the itch kind of thing, because as a coder, technical people tend to do that. They get, I got an idea and they spend a weekend and then they move on or they keep running with it depending on the process.
Yeah. Well, as far as in Postgres goes, like I said, I think that I just think that the modern data stack is a challenge. It's a lot. You have to build a lot of data pipelines, and so I would just say it's not a small itch that we're trying to scratch. It's a big itch. I instantly started with 10 people. Big team, raising $6.5 million. And just going at this thing. I think everything in Postgres is bigger because it's already at scale. There's so many users, there's so much already been built. So unfortunately, doing a weekend project in Postgres is pretty hard to get noticed.
That's true.
Yeah. So, but we're taking it. We're going to take it one step further than that. We're doing something we're calling stacks right now. But the idea here would be like, let's say you're a Postgres consultant. I know you are one, and I haven't talked to you about this yet, but I think it'd be really cool again that if you have a recipe for how to do a read heavy Postgres deployment, here's how we configure it. Here's the extensions we want to use. We're looking to create a way to codify, call it like reusable starting kits, for a Postgres deployment that you can then tailor and tweak. But as like you start with a blank slate. Most people start with a blank slate. Again, inside of a consultancy, maybe you guys have, your own internal templating system. But yeah, we think that it would be great if you could, again, if I want to have a data warehouse on Postgres, I shouldn't have to look at all the extensions. I should be able to just go to Tembo and say, give me data warehousing. And we've already vetted, written guides on how to do it, just great documentation, great technology in the box. It should just work like as if it was a product designed for such a thing, And so that's kind of like the level 2 solution we're building on top of the extension. This is why we have to have like the ability to install extensions really easily, is because they're just building blocks to me of a higher level solution.
Sure. Well, and to, affirm your point, I mean, we've been around for 26 years. We have templates for everything, right?
Yeah.
And some of them, are no longer even relevant just because of how long we've been around. It's interesting. You talk about now, is Tembo going to be managed only, or are people going to be able to like pay, like say, give you, I don't know, $9.99, and they can download a template and install it on prem?
Yeah, we're gonna. My plan is that you can run it on a single instance as open source, so that it will be, our only commercialization will be as a SaaS product. But I think for any idea, to succeed inside of an open source ecosystem, the core idea has to be open source, and it needs to be freely available to install, for self-hosted people. So it'll we're going to have stuff that runs on a single instance. But again, another thing we're trying to do in Tempo is what I'm calling fleet management. So if you have, again, 10 Postgreses, one that's one that's masquerading as a data warehouse, one that's a traditional transactional, maybe there's one that's masquerading as a MongoDB, like take a Ferret DB or something like that. I think it'd be great to be able to see all those things together as well. So we want to build a view that's across these stacks, across use cases, if you've got excess capacity sitting over in cluster B, why not let me know that so I can go give that excess capacity to cluster A that's maybe struggling. So so I just think that there's just so much awesome opportunity. There's like a lot of problems that haven't really been addressed yet, and so yeah, I mean we've got a very ambitious roadmap, but so we've got a great team and we're getting on it here in our early days.
Well, you hit on a couple things here that are you said open source, you said single instance.
Mm-hmm.
So what if it's a horizontal partitioning? That's not a single instance. Are you
Um, that's a good question. I think it'll work for like horizontal like partitions. Yeah, that's fine too. What I'm saying is like if you have just like two distinct deployments of Postgres, the open source wouldn't necessarily know about each other, whereas our platform's gonna try to fuse that data together into
Oh,
a
I see.
highest level view. Yeah,
Okay. And then you
yeah,
also said you think that at least the core needs to be open source, which for the record I agree with you. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on open versus open source. Right? Open source is a
yeah,
real term, trademarked. You can't even say that without
yes,
it being qualified under their licensing. So
yeah,
there's others in the market and the ecosystem that are like, we're purely open, but we're not open source. What are your
yeah.
feelings there?
Yeah, I've got strong feelings. I actually think it's if you're I'm against the pedantic, like if your source code is readable and usable by 99.9% of people, I think that I'm okay with people calling it open source. If they have like the restriction that you can't make money off of this, that to me doesn't in my opinion disqualify it as open source. I know a lot of people feel that way, but like that license is good enough for me. If it's a license that's more restrictive than that, then perhaps we're getting out of the domain of it's certainly open. I would say it's nearly open source, but our stuff is going to be like Postgres license. We decided normally I would say Apache 2 license. I'm coming from the Apache world with
Sure.
Apache Airflow, but we're just adopting the Postgres license for everything we do since it's the open version in this ecosystem. So yeah,
Yeah, the interesting issue that I run into is that, because of, my network and also dealing with PostgreSconf and all that, I deal with a lot of marketing people. And they'll say,
yeah,
well, it's open source. And I'll say, what license?
yeah,
And they'll say, well,
yeah,
it's under such and such a license, which is legally not open source, right? The courts have decided.
yeah,
That being said, I find it interesting that the open core or these other pseudo open licenses where they basically say you can do whatever you want with it as long as you don't open a hosting like a SaaS
yeah,
product off of it.
yeah,
And the problem with that is there's a huge glaring, like, there's a cave size hole through that
right,
because it's this simple. Let's say Elasticsearch as an example. Okay,
yep,
I can't create a SaaS product, but I can still call it managed Elastic. And what I
mm,
do is I say, Rye, you want to run Elasticsearch, great for you. You install it through the AMI in your network, and then you pay us a support
manage it.
contract.
Yeah, yeah,
Same basic thing, and it's a huge loophole. And I don't think a lot of people are
yeah.
thinking about it. And I don't think that they really, I think that the idea that open source is actually open source scared the hell out of them because they didn't know what they were getting into.
Yeah, I think like they wouldn't if you were to talk to the CEO of Elastic, they would probably say that's fine. Like in fact, I don't care if you install it for them because you're basically I think what they're mostly worried about are the big clouds. That
Right.
that's the enemy. Maybe there's a couple of startups that could come off that are trying to you know be a remora off of them that they would like to be able to tell them to screw off as well. But mostly it's the Amazons of the world. Amazon, Google,
Sure.
Azure that they care the most about, and that's why I say it's like 99.9% of people can use it. It's just those three organizations are the only ones that you're really trying to prevent. I think it's dumb to do personally. Like I think that it's dumb to uh, prevent prevent them from validating your open source project. We saw this with Airflow. So we were the first ones to start a managed service at Astronomer. Then Google created one, then Amazon created one, and then Azure has now created one. And all that has done is solidify Airflow as a winner, and it helped our business. Sure, we lost a couple deals here and there, or it created friction in sales, but overall, it really hurt our competitors, the other open source projects. So I think there's competition at the open source layer and at the commercial layer. And if you can't win the open source layer, you got nothing anyway. So
Well,
I don't think you should shoot. Yeah.
I think you have a good point there. One of the things that the .org community, PostgreSQL.org, there's a lot in there that get frustrated with, say, an Amazon or a Microsoft because they create like RDS, which is a closed source fork. And the number. Let's be very clear: the number one deployed Postgres instance in the world is RDS, hands down.
Yeah.
Number one by far. And I think that there's some academics, some pedantics, some old school OGs that really have a problem with that. But in reality, what they should be doing is saying to themselves, holy shit, one of the largest, greatest, biggest companies in the world has validated the work we have done over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Right? And to be fair, Amazon at this point is actually the fourth largest contributor to the project. A lot of people are, I'm not going to use RDS. I'm not going to use Amazon. They're just taking, and they literally are. They are the fourth largest contributor to PostgreSQL.org.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely all getting better. 5 years ago or 8 years ago, it was different.
Sure.
It seemed a lot more like they were just taking and not giving. But I think that those companies now recognize that it's good business for them to have a few committers or people contributing to the project.
Well, I think a lot of it is maturity as well, because I had deep conversations with Amazon and with Microsoft in regards to both of this problem back then and going forward. And the reality is they just didn't. It's not that they didn't want to give back. It's a lot of it they didn't know how to do it without being offending the community, or making people feel like, oh, the big bad companies coming in, they're going to take over. Or in a lot of instances, especially if you talk about PostgreSQL.org, the process to contribute to PostgreSQL.org is challenging. I think
old school.
It's not. No, it's not old school. I was around in the old school. It's challenging. It's it used to be. I mean, you're talking about a project that there is no way to go and say, hey, these are the current tasks or tickets or issues, right? There's no, you got to go through a mailing list. Nobody reads mailing lists anymore. It's just, it's pretty non-transparent. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. They don't want to fly. It was interesting when I learned about how Postgres does it. It was, my first reaction was, that's not normal. But I actually think that there's some pros to it. That if you're, you own the code that you commit. So if we had a bunch of flyby commits in Postgres, like we do in Airflow, we have this. Like in Airflow, we actually have many contributors. It's wide open. We let people, we encourage people, but it's a little different in the sense that we have in Airflow, we have a bunch of operators that are open, like even like the Google operator for Airflow is in the main repo, so like you have to let people edit that kind of code. Especially if the Google people want to maintain it, great, so, but yeah, I think that given the scope of the project, I think it's kind of a cool variation of open source the way they're doing it in some ways. Obviously in some ways it's bad because it's hard to get inside that circle. I'm sure, and people who want to get inside, the bar is high. But I think it's kind of interesting, and I'm excited to get closer to it. We're still pretty far away from it. I'm just kind of like, we got to build some street cred, and then someday we'll have. I haven't had any conversation with any committer yet, but someday I will.
Well, for me, I mean, let's give credit where credit is due. I mean, remarkable code base, very few CVEs that are published, stable.
Yeah.
It does what it's supposed to do. So it's not that they don't produce a good product. They clearly do, because everybody is starting to use it in one way, shape, or form or other, right? Period.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you're someone who's not used to the old school or OG way of doing open source, and you're coming in and you're like, hey, and you've got all this passion, there's not a whole lot of onboarding, hand holding,
Yeah.
newbie guides, none of that. And I think that it really turns off a lot of opportunity to get people in there with fresh ideas and things that can
Yeah.
be built.
Yeah, which might be the design, like if you've got your plates are full, if you have 40 guys with 40 people with full plates and there's not really much room for more stuff on their plate, then you're not really solving a problem by making it 10 times easier to throw ideas for what should be on the plate. And again, I'm assuming everyone feels pretty busy inside that core and they're not like wondering, hoping more ideas would come in from the community.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it used to be that a lot of us didn't get paid to contribute, right?
Yeah.
But I would say by far the majority of hackers and certainly committers, they're all gainfully employed with very nice salaries now. I mean, that's the nature of a mature project. You get compensated for the work that you do. It's no longer a hobby.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so hey, before we get a little deeper into this, because there are other opportunities to talk about, I'm kind of curious. I want to bounce back to um, something that's kind of happened as a society. With the pandemic, all of our civil liberties were, revoked, and everyone was shoved into a closet and told to work from home. I may have some particularly slanted opinions about this, not about the work from home, since I've done that since like 2004 or something like that, but from the lockdowns. But how do you feel about the ongoing debate? I mean, like, should we work from home? Should it be hybrid? What do you find as someone who is of my generation in
Yeah.
terms of productivity and capabilities of getting things done, all that type of stuff?
Yeah, I think that we are a remote first company. I work out of my house almost all the time. Um, I think that there's definitely I mean it's just such a different experience. Like you could certainly be distracted here. Like I could just decide to go watch TV. I can go watch a movie right in the middle of the day. And no one's gonna know. It could be that I'm solving some hugely hard technical problem, or I could be watching a movie. Nobody knows.
Or
But I
both,
think that
frankly.
or both, yeah. Which, yeah, I don't know how people can do that. Like, I can't. Yeah, I can't. I can listen to like classical music when I'm doing something, but if there's words going on, but no, I think that I am in favor of our current system, which is hybrid. Like for our company, we're going to get together for a week every quarter, and that's essentially 1/13 of our work lives will be spent together. What's the right percentage? I don't think it's 100%. Like you don't want to be in like contact with your coworkers 100% of the time. So I think that hybrid's good. I think that asynchronous work is great. Like I think the way open source projects work are pretty good, and things get done. But you have to have people that are excited and motivated. And so I think the tricky part is you got to just care a little bit more about how people are feeling. Whereas if you have them in your office, they're prisoners. They're either working or hiding in the bathroom, and it's here you have to like figure out a way to actually have them work on something that they're interested and engaged in. So
Do you
I
think
think
that
that we're going to see a lot. Yeah, yeah,
do you think there's a difference? So your company and my company, technical companies, right? I think
yeah,
have a leg up on this by nature of the type of work that we do. But on the other hand, you take someone like a J.P. Morgan, or even an Amazon. Obviously, a lot of people are giving Amazon a hard time for their back to work
yeah,
policy or back to office policy. Um, but it's my experience. One, it takes a special person to actually be able to stay productive remote,
hmm,
right? It's really easy. I mean, as human beings, most of us are geared to be social animals. and
Yep.
it can be demoralizing um, to not have that interaction. I mean, I remember, I mean, this was obviously years ago and it's a little personal, but when I got divorced, the custody was 50-50. So there was 1 week, I mean, two weeks a month where I was literally alone and I worked
Mm,
from home.
mm.
I would go to the store just so someone would say, "Hi, how are you?" They don't really care. They're just doing their job, but just so I could feel like, okay, I am still human. I'm not a troll, right? And I think
Yeah.
that especially with the younger generations, when we're talking about say 22 to 30-ish, right? Especially pandemic adults, right? Where they came into an adulthood right around the pandemic. I think it might actually be really good to kind of like reintroduce them to society. And one way to do that is through, look, you're coming in, we're doing the meetings, we're doing the marketing sessions, we're doing the idea sessions, the stand ups, all that type of stuff. I mean, just from a
Yeah.
holistic perspective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have an office here in Cincinnati. I just signed a lease on it. For the people that are here, they're encouraged to go. They're not required to go. I don't personally go as much as I should, just because, like I said, I actually feel well. Like take today. Here's a difference. Like, okay, so Tuesdays for us are internal meeting days at the company, and so that means I meet with all my direct reports, and I meet with once a month. I meet with people who are my direct reports. So it's a full day. We have our team meeting on Tuesdays as well, and like, there's no way that the the productive conversation that happened today amongst my team could ever happen inside the office. There's no way that people would be like, there's 8 meeting rooms and we're all like, doing all these one on ones. You would have like water cooler talk for sure.
Yeah.
You'd have like unimportant conversations happening. And some of our conversations obviously are just like, hey, how's the weather there, blah blah blah. But I just don't think that you would have like the intense schedule that this company has on Tuesdays, for example, if we were in the office, because it would just look so weird to have like it would be like speed dating. It's like it's kind of sort of what we're doing is we're speed dating, and you don't do that in the office. You let osmosis do its job a little bit, like, oh, I can overhear someone else's conversation or get filled in after someone comes out of a meeting. um, so then, you take Tuesdays, and then we also have on Wednesdays, we have external meetings. So if there's interviews, like we say, like, do all that stuff on Wednesdays. Maybe maybe half of your day is ruined by interviews, potential hires. So now you got 3.5 days of deep work. And I think that's a great ratio, if you think about it that way. Like, I can give my guys, now, will they use that time for deep work? Who knows? I hope so. But, it's possible, and I think like having 3.5 days of deep work in an office is absolutely impossible. Even if you put your headphones on, like someone's tapping you on the shoulder, asking you questions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think actually from that perspective, especially as a technical company, I think you're
Yeah.
spot on. I mean, we do something similar, but what we do is basically Monday and Fridays are leadership days.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't do call unless it's an emergency or pre-approved. There are no phone calls for leadership on Mondays and Fridays because it's all about prepping the week and prepping the next week, closing out
Mm-hmm.
issues, those types of things, so that we can start each week productivity with a productive
Yeah.
mindset.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So now let's move on. As a founder, I'm a founder, you're a founder.
Yeah.
We take a slightly different mentality towards founding. Um, because of my experience when I was just a young lad, I did get involved with some VC external investors. This is before
Yeah.
Command Prompt existed, and it really put a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah.
I founded a couple of ISPs back before ISPs were a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so Command Prompt, we're like 86% employee owned.
Yeah.
Um, so it's a little bit, cash basis, things like that. You went a different route. Obviously, it worked out for you. I'm quite happy for you. Um, but what would be your advice for people like I've got an idea, I want to launch it. What's your advice for first time founders?
Yeah. Well, and I did services companies too. Back when you were doing an ISP, I was building a web design company in '95. So um, yeah, what was interesting, and I don't know how it is today, but like back then, it's kind of easy to start a services company. However, it's not easy when you have some success, for example, and you need working capital. Like I was one of the things I learned really quick, really early on. Like if you have $100,000 a month in revenue, that's great. Like you've got a company, you've got this, but you need to collect that cash, get it to employees. And like it's not a perfectly efficient system unless you're able to bill up front, which people do a lot more now. But back in when I used to do it, we were getting paid 30, 60, 90 days after the work was done. And we were doing project billing too, which is just the worst idea ever. But, hey, $30,000 will build you a website, half up front. Sounds good. Getting the second half sucks. um, but anyway, it was like, um, I still say like start a services company though as your first company because you learn the basics. You learn the basics of money. It's like it's a lot. Well, you don't have to pitch VCs, obviously. You don't have to pitch investors. You don't have to get anyone's permission. You just go and do it. Creating an LLC is nearly free, and yeah, it's all single member LLC. Taxes are really simple. So I definitely think that like people should not start with have their first company shouldn't be a venture backed startup, but a lot of people are trying to do that, and I think that's like I wouldn't personally invest in first time founders like that because there's just too much to learn. like it's like you're trying to take an accelerated degree, finish a bachelor's degree in a year. It's too much content, too fast. So
It's
yeah,
interesting
I'm a big.
it's interesting that you say that. One, to start with a services company, and two, that you wouldn't necessarily invest in as a first time someone who's a first time founder who hadn't had that experience.
Yeah.
I was involved with multiple small businesses before I started Command Prompt, and the reason we started Command Prompt was a service business. And we Command Prompt has kind of floated up and down, right? We've been a product business and a services business, depending on what decade we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But we found that services for us, the difficulty with services is exactly what you said. You have a situation where you are literally billing like every 15 minutes. And then once you
Yeah.
get employees, you need to make sure they get paid. And then you end up in this situation where maybe you do have a great idea, but you really don't have any capital to build it out because all your money, even if you're profitable, even well profitable like Command Prompt, you have to have your cash reserves for the lean months, right?
Yep.
Whereas with a product, once, even if it only has mild success, you get to kind of ride a year of product delivery, right? And you get that
Yeah.
profit out of it, and it kind of builds up your reserves for other things.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think that's exactly true. And like I said, um, no, I still think like it's way more fun for me. Like after doing some services companies, I probably won't go back to that ever because once you figure out how to work with VCs and you have a reputation of having success with them, it's like a totally different world, to have that it's like you're on a bike going downhill, by default rather than uphill by default, and that's a nice thing to have.
Definitely.
Not to say you're going to win any races or anything like that, because all the startups have cash, and there's always a competitor for you. So everyone's got a downhill race, but I still think like um, it's it's a fun thing to be doing. I'm enjoying, my last, I started in 2015. It was the first time I did a venture backed company. So it's now been 8 years of this.
So what would, you know, two of my favorite venture capital stories. One is
Mm.
Great Bridge, and one is Nautilus. Do you know what Nautilus is?
Nah, not off the top of my head.
Okay. So anytime you open, if you run Linux as your desktop and you open the file manager,
Yep.
that's Nautilus.
Okay.
years and years ago, this was, I don't know how long ago, but it like '05 or something like that. I'd have to look it up. Basically, they were developing this, and the idea was that you would build a store around it, like a
Mm.
Ubuntu store or something, or like Google App Store or whatever. And that's how you would interact with Linux, and you'd be able to like buy something from this store and download it and run it. Not necessarily a
Yeah.
bad idea, except that there's no real way to make money of that.
Hmm.
And this is something that's always bugged me about certain VCs. Nautilus raised $15 million. Nautilus lost $15 million. They no longer exist.
Yeah.
How does a VC not see the glaring hole in that
Yeah.
business idea? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
the moment Nautilus announced this is what we're doing, I'm like, well, shit, there goes 15 million bucks. And
Yeah.
sure enough,
Yeah, especially to Linux users,
yeah,
that's
who don't want to
tricky.
pay for anything.
Yeah, that's right. Like yeah, I would say same idea, but with Apple users. Okay, yeah, that's a successful thing, right? Like App Store.
Right.
uh, so yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, well, there's obviously a lot of bad VCs, but there's also a lot of bad founders. And combination of those can make some bad decisions. Obviously, you know, raising money from a VC is a sales process, just like you know selling uh, a services
Sure.
contract, and you can sell. Good salespeople can sell ice to Eskimos. So I'd say that's one of those situations. Like, why would a company that doesn't have Postgres in production buy a service contract for Postgres? It's like I'm sure you've probably sold that before because they're like, we're gonna do it, right? Like we're in a POC, we're gonna do this big switch over, and a year later they never did it. Like why they buy it? So I think that that there's they're reaching, and who knows? I don't know too much about the VC that made that decision, but they. I mean, again, it sounded like it probably happened before Apple App Store, and so I'd say they were close but no cigar. Shows the wrong audience.
Well, and that,
uh,
and there is definitely in Apple is a perfect example. Actually, there's definitely an argument for too much too soon. Right?
mm,
Remember the Newton?
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
The Newton
absolutely.
was a great product. It was just way before its time.
Yeah, it may have had an App Store on it too. I don't remember,
Yeah, it
but
was a long
who
time
knows?
ago.
Yeah,
I think you and I would probably had more hair and were a little skinnier. Um,
yeah, definitely.
all right, so let's bounce back to Postgres here a little bit. You are actually relatively new to Postgres, right? But you've got a lot of open source experience, Airflow and
Yeah,
such.
well, I would say I've been a Postgres user since I don't know when. Like Postgres to me has been for a long time just the default. Like I'm going to use Postgres. I think that when I started using Ruby on Rails, that's when that happened for me, and that was like 2008 or something. So I've been a Postgres user. It was always like SQLite in production, or I'm sorry, SQLite in development for Rails, and then we just used Postgres on production, and it was sort of because Heroku made Postgres so easy, and so yeah, I've been a user for a long time, but I would say I've been a dumb user in the sense that I just did whatever I used whatever my ORM
Right.
gave me, and didn't really use any advanced features of Postgres ever. I think that's the default state for most Postgres users. Again, like we're going to just like take a survey. If you were going to go to random RDS users, for example, and be like, "Are you using advanced features of Postgres?" It's going to be no, 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 no. 1 out of 100 might say yes. So
Well, and now you've just made every Postgres passionate person cry. Thank you for that.
yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, don't you think though? Don't you think?
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I know why it happens. I mean, command
Yeah.
prompts, almost all of command prompts business now is basically fixing all the dumb things developers do because they code to the ORM. And
Yeah.
don't get me wrong. I mean, I get the point of an ORM, absolutely. And when you're
Yeah.
talking about getting to market, getting the job done, it makes things really simple. But once you get to scale, you got
Yeah.
to break out of it.
For sure. Well, I think it teaches. I mean, it allows you to be basically, I like to say like a lot of these Postgres instances are operating with an e-brake on, like, and they're just like grinding through their emergency brake all day long, and like it could use half the resources if they just did X, Y, or Z, but you have to hire a pro to identify those issues today. I would say that the platforms don't do a very good job of saying this e-brake is on, or like, there's no, whatever the problem might be. Like take index as a simple example. Heroku doesn't send me an email when it recognizes the fact that, hey, your database is really, really slow. These queries are slow because you're missing an index.
Right.
And it easily could, but so I think that's like, the reality is most of these things are not just not using advanced features, but they're using the basic features very poorly. And it's only once you get to scale and have an outage or some major problems that you suddenly start to. But I'll tell you what, not first. The first thing you do is just like, let's just double the resources, see if that fixes it.
That's
And
right.
it does,
Give us more CPUs, more RAM, more disk. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
All you did was
double
extend the runway of pain.
Yeah. And these, there's so many CPUs and, so much RAM now that you can double about, 6 times before you run out of computer sizing. And then
No,
by that time, yeah.
And when you get there, though, and the thing is, the pain. Although I have no problem with the philosophy of, okay, it's slower, add resources, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to run your business. You got to make money. You got to pay employees. I understand. But there's also a ceiling where you have to take a moment and say, look, if I have to do this one more time, we're going to go over a cliff, right?
Yeah.
Bring someone in and the people that actually know this stuff underneath and say, look, if you do this, I'll take this. I mean, and this is like an every week occurrence for command prompt. Client comes in, great client, been with them, for a long time. They're like, we have this 5-minute query. Can you fix it? And we'll spend a day on it with various things, but all of a sudden it runs in, 30 seconds versus 5 minutes.
Right.
And they're just blown away. They think it's magic. And it's not. It's just, this is our expertise, domain expertise.
Yep. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's it. Yeah, and you're going to solve in solving that one query, you probably made everything else quicker too. Yeah.
Well, sure, because everything else isn't waiting on whatever that query's doing, right?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Now, everyone knows that Lindsay's our producer, and you had mentioned to her that you think that Postgres extensions are generally under-celebrated.
Yeah.
I would agree to some extent. I mean, I think that through time, there's some de facto extensions that are kind of like, why aren't you running this? But what do you mean by that? What is it? I mean, obviously, Tembo has a vested interest in this idea, but what is it?
That's right. Well, yeah. So I think that it's just unknown. Like I said earlier, like the quality of any extension is completely unknown to me. Like I don't know how many people are using it. If I'm new, if I'm like if I just like a lot of people they just learn about extensions and they're like, whoa, there's a bunch of extensions. What do they all do? And it's really hard to know, like, I don't know, you tell me, what's the top extension? Maybe you can say, like, we've seen X deployments, you could run some statistical analysis that say, at least within the command prompted community, which extensions are most popular, but you probably haven't done that. Or if you have done that, it's not like live and at your fingertips,
Right.
so that you could tell me which ones are getting more popular, which ones are dropping in popularity. And so we want to do that. If there's a fast rising extension that's interesting, like here's a great example, like PG Vector.
I knew you were going to bring that one up.
You knew I was, yeah.
I did.
And like,
I did.
It's like I said, like, is it 10 times slower than Pinecone? Is it half the speed of Pinecone? Like, who's done that work? Some people have built this thing, and that's hard. It's like hard to build technology, and like the problem with open source is you don't have a product team to glorify the work you've done. Which is what like these tech companies have. They spend maybe half their money in the beginning on building a bit of technology, and then they spend the other half of their money like selling it, marketing it, supporting it, writing guides and tutorials for it. And so I just think it's going to be true of any open source project. They don't have that halo of help, and so I think it'd be great if we could provide that in some way to some of these
So
potentially great projects. Yeah, who knows,
in one way, though, I mean, because you keep bringing up, you don't know the quality, so on and so forth. I mean, you just described Linux as a whole,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
There's no way that Ubuntu is testing every single package they have available, right? They have a
right,
core set that they test, and the rest of them, that's why there's contributed modules. And they're relying a lot on the lift of Debian, for example. And they're relying a
yeah,
lot on just the general acceptance of the code as something usable throughout the whole Linux ecosystem.
yeah,
Now, in your situation, you're kind of doing the same thing, but the ecosystem isn't nearly as mature.
yeah. Well, in some ways, yeah, it's true that it's not mature in some ways, but on the other hand, like some of these guys have raised millions of dollars to build a Postgres extension. So,
Sure.
you know,
Well, you think
uh,
of like time scale?
well, I was thinking of Ferret actually.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Like Ferret's they've raised some money and they're building this thing, and it's probably pretty good, but like, um, they're on their own. They're on their own. Like, is EDB helping them? Is Crunchy helping them? Is Amazon, Google, anybody, any of the big players in Postgres helping them?
Well, not that I know of. I mean, I've talked to them, of
Managed
course.
services. Yeah, of course. Yeah, but I'm saying like the managed services aren't celebrating Ferret DB. And again, like first of all, we got to figure out, is it celebratable? Like someone's got to like go and do an assessment of it and try it. But I just think like if I can build a platform where Ferret can be celebrated and easily, with one click deployed, that would be. And maybe Ferret's not the perfect example. There's like, the more money you raise, the more independent you want to be.
Mhm.
But it's just a sliding scale there, and so somewhere there's a sweet spot of extensions that are great, but nobody knows that they're great. And I'd love to identify them and productize them. Basically, build them into a single platform that, um, someone who wants to do Postgres plus plus, has a place to get that, because right now it doesn't exist anywhere.
Well, I do think that, I mean, just like any healthy ecosystem, uh, competition is good,
Yeah.
especially if it's positive competition, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much money to be made. I think that finding ways for people within the ecosystem to work together where it makes sense is
Yeah.
obviously a plus. The ultimate VC funded, organization would be Enterprise DB, right? I mean, they've
Yeah.
been funded and reverse merged and funded and reverse merged and everything that they had to do to continue to get where they're going now. But they're all, they're a little different because, and this isn't to take away from their contributions. They clearly contribute. They're the number one contributor to PostgreSQL.org, right? So I don't want to take away from that. But they're a closed source company. I mean,
Mm.
hands down, they're a closed source company. Whereas someone like a Ferret, they're an open source company. You yourself are saying that the core is going to be open source. That's an open source thing. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of value there because once you make something open source, your competition is also your partner.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And like, cloud native. I'm sorry. EDB has some stuff open source. Yeah, I agree that probably the bulk of it is. But like, for example, we've been talking with them about their Postgres operator, cloud native PG,
Yeah.
and adopting that and partnering up on that. So I think where we can partner with these guys, we will. I want to, we don't want to just, you know, uh, those are moves in the right direction, and we want to celebrate and support that stuff. But our core, well, here's another example. It's like master, who, multi-master replication.
Hmm.
They're on the opposite side of that. They acquire again. Like I'm coming to this, and I'm just hearing like the legends of what's happened in the past, because I was not paying attention to Postgres ecosystem, but like second quadrant had some multi-master stuff. They got
Hmm.
acquired, got shut down. And that was a different era of EDB, I'm sure. And maybe if EDB was buying that in 2023, maybe they do it a different way. But the bottom line was, like, I just think in open source, we need to have horizontal scalability with multi-master and Postgres so that you can have two nodes that are both doing a job. Again, I know you can sort of do it with sharding and partitioning and all that kind of stuff. But I just, from a simplicity standpoint, I think it'd be really cool if I could deploy a Postgres, deploy a pair for it. One of them goes down, that's okay. Everything goes over here. The other one pops back up, and like you have just higher reliability, higher uptime. And that's a dream I have for Postgres for not just big deployments, but small deployments.
It's an interesting. So you're right. So second quadrant had what was called BDR, and
Yeah.
BDR is actually open source. You can go to it right now and get it. And then
Yeah.
when they made BDR3, that was closed source because they re-architected it knowing the limitations of what they learned. And then
Yeah.
EDB bought them, and they still have BDR, but it's still closed source.
Yeah.
The most latest rendition, and it would be similar to your idea on open source, would be PG Edge, right? They have
Yeah.
taken their investment and they're putting that into their new version of BDR, which is based on the old version that was open source.
Yeah.
And their
But they've
version
got the
is,
license problem.
well, it's open core. Yeah, it's not open
Yeah.
source now.
Well, now open core would imply that that the core of your business is open source, but I wouldn't even call it again. If we're talking about open source, to be open core means you have to have open source in your core, but they have something that we couldn't use. Let's put it that
Yeah,
way.
well, yeah, that's something you couldn't use. It's
Yeah,
they
maybe with
described it to me as
permission.
like the
Yeah,
Confluent license.
right. Yeah, yeah. And we thought about using the Confluent license too, but we just decided, like, it's just not worth it. It just creates ill will with the wrong people. It
Hmm.
doesn't. It does have some protection, but I just think, like, to me, if I can't use it, I'm going to create the open source alternative to your thing. Like that's what I'll
So
do.
you said master to master, active active, and that's kind of
Yeah,
one of your dreams. Now, this is an interesting problem because as long as I have been doing this, I think I've run into one problem that active active would solve.
yeah. Well, I just think, like, uptime. Like, if you wanted to install a new extension that requires a restart, you're taking a little downtime, right?
Sure.
With present day Postgres, and like a lot of other services don't work that way. In in Kubernetes, you can run like multiple replicas of a service, and instead of, like, giving two CPUs to one node, you can give one CPU to two nodes, and it's just more resilient that way. If one of them falls over, the service doesn't go away. So I mean, that's really just an uptime thing for me. Is that I want to be able to restart Postgres every day, if we want to, without creating downtime
Well,
issues.
now there's definitely definitely got an argument there. I mean, it's
Yeah,
easy enough to create the five nines on a failover scenario. The hard
yeah,
part for Postgres is bringing back up the other node,
yeah,
right? That's where Postgres falls down, is that all of a sudden we have to do that binary backup again, and we have to turn it back into a secondary. And for a moment in time, unless you have three nodes, for a moment
yeah,
in time, you are operating at not only a reduced capacity, but a reduced availability. So
yeah.
that is
That's right.
definitely a problem.
Yeah, and it's not like something that I feel, like you said, it's not like a huge operational problem, because the answer to that is just don't restart it very much. Like,
Right.
there is a workaround. But like I said, I think it'd be a better world. Like I said, I'd rather have my databases running as a little cluster of machines working together, and load balancing it by default. And we did that with Airflow too. Like, Airflow had this thing called the scheduler that when we came to the project, if the scheduler fell over, no Airflow work was happening. So all your pipelines were like backing up effectively, and then when you turn them back on, if it was down for an hour, now it's like might be DDoSing, certain things that, as it's doing more work than it normally does. It could just be DDoSing a Postgres database, that it's trying to write now as fast as it can to, because like you didn't build your pipelines for this failure mode, you built it for the normal mode, So anyway, we fixed that, so we made it so that the scheduler, it's a much easier problem than I think Postgres, but we built it so the scheduler runs two or three schedulers at one time, and it just divvies up the work, and it's it without you having to think about it, So like I said, there's some nice workarounds in Postgres that I would say are for bigger deployments. I'm just not a fan of like having a hot backup of anything that isn't getting work, isn't getting any workload onto it. It's like, God, it seems painful to me, that to be paying to have this data replicated and it's just standing by, literally 99 point, whatever your uptime is, it's standing by, that much percentage of the time and
Well, I
not
would
doing work
hope that
for
you
your
would at least be
company.
distributing your queries, right?
Well, hopefully, but do people do that naturally? Well, maybe they do. Yeah, I don't know.
It's a pretty common thing to at least
Yeah,
use the
you
read
should.
hot
Yeah,
standby type
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
You
yeah,
brought up PG Vector. Talk to me about this. You gave a general session at PostgreSQL Silicon Valley. And you were just
yeah.
kind of talking about some of the extensions that kind of interested you. And you brought up PG Vector, but one of the things you brought up a couple of them, and they're all written in Rust.
Yeah.
So is this an affinity for yourself, or is it just the technology that they're producing with it?
So yeah, for me, it's again, it's a company brand thing in some ways. Extensions are part of our brand, and we've decided Rust is part of our brand. I think Rust is interesting at this point in time for Postgres because it happens to be the most beloved language. Like if you go check, like, and I don't know how this all works out, but like people love Rust, that use Rust, and so I think there could be a Cambrian explosion of new extensions created because you have Postgres writing C++. I know that I don't know what percentage of developers can write C++, but it's definitely a single digit thing, considering how many shitty developers there are in the world.
Well, especially since
That are,
it's most people would use C, right?
yeah, well, right. C or C++. Well, bottom line is most people are JavaScript or
Right.
Python
Yeah, certainly.
developers, and so yeah, I think that like Rust is interesting language. We've adopted it at our company to be like the first language we go to for anything, and that way we can aggregate some Rust knowledge and talent inside the company. And like I said, I think it's a little bit more accessible than how we've written extensions in the past for Postgres. So I'm hoping that if we can get this thing going where we're celebrating these celebratable extensions, it would be pretty cool to me if then suddenly there's 2 to 3 times more of those types of extensions coming about. So I just think it's a path towards an abundance of riches, an extension chooser, a user.
Well, you know, this is interesting. First of all, I have nothing against Rust, except for
Yeah.
to produce Hello World should be print Hello
Yeah.
World, okay? And that's not
Yes.
what it
Yeah.
is in Rust. That being said, I think there might be a conflict though. One of the things that you're trying to do is bring a certain legitimacy and expectation of quality and performance,
Mm.
productivity to the extensions for Postgres, and
Yeah.
therefore, by side effect, the ecosystem.
Yeah.
As awesome as Rust is, and I know a lot of people that are very passionate about it, there's largely a disconnect between a lack of Rust leadership in the project, and then
Mm.
there's a separate entity called the Rust Foundation, and then there's not a whole. It's not confidence inspiring. The Rust
Yeah.
project leadership is anything
Yeah.
but confidence inspiring.
I mean, I saw some stuff on Twitter about this, like in the past few days. I don't know, maybe are you talking about
Well,
the
that's
past
what
month?
brought it up, but that's not the only
Yeah.
incident of it. Sure.
Yeah. And so to me, like again, I'm just going by what the developers think and not necessarily what the the leadership squabbles, maybe, so I just don't know what I mean, obviously the alternative could be C, but uh, I don't know. Like if Rust doesn't win, there'll be. I know that there's already like spin-off attempts. I forget Crablang, and there's like
Yeah.
there's people trying to do a new thing. And if Rust if if Rust the team fails, then something like that'll take over, and it'll probably work as well.
Well, I
So
mean, I
yeah,
think from an open source perspective, I think that the problem that you run into in something that the Rust, and when I say the Rust leadership, I'm specifically talking about the Rust project.
yeah,
And yes, there was a big hoopla. In fact, I even had people that texted me over the weekend or like, "Have you seen this?" You know,
yeah,
open source nerd gossip, right? The
yeah,
and there, from a mature project perspective, the moment you become, if you're going to do this open source thing and you want to be in leadership, there's certain requirements to do that and to do it right. Now, there are variances of what right is. There's a little bit that's subjective, but proper communication, transparency, what is your decision making process, and all of the major open source projects, even the old school ones like Postgres, have figured this out. And they've
yeah,
stumbled as they've done it, but they figured it out. And generally speaking, it works. Apache
yeah.
Foundation has their incubation program and all that stuff.
Mhm.
It seems to me that the moment Mozilla like spun it out, it's the project itself is just it's catering in on it, the cratering in on itself, and it would give me pause as a company to be like, if my developers came to me and said, "Look, we're going to deploy this thing in Rust," and
Yeah,
as someone who's educated in this, I would say, "Hey, look." I mean, I know Rust is great. I know you love it. I know it's productive. I know that it's memory safe and all this, but here's the reality of it. I have zero indication that there's not going to be 17 forks with 17 different indicators or nuances over the next couple of years until the
yeah.
melting pot comes back together and figures it out.
I feel like that's going to be so slow moving that it's like it's not going to affect my company's journey. I mean, it could, right? If it blows up in some very spectacular way. But the question is, what happens to Rust, the computer language, if again, I don't know. I barely know the drama that you talked about, but let's say that a bunch of people leave. Like, isn't that a good thing? It probably could be a good thing for the Rust if the toxic people left the project.
Well, I think I would agree with you if it was the toxic people that were leaving.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
you know, and
we'll
that isn't
see.
like I
Yeah,
don't know. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say, like, I'll have to do some more research because I don't really know. But like the drama from this weekend seemed very. I was like, I had to reread it like 6 times to try to understand. Someone's keynote got demoted to a regular talk, and they were promised a keynote. But like there was a bunch of like there was clearly something behind the scenes that wasn't being told. But like I had to read someone summarized it with ChatGPT, and I read through it. And like like talks get demoted. I and honestly, the topic that they were talking about, it seemed very like detailed, technical. Not keynote word, but so like some of the anyway. The point is like I'm not sure what happened behind the scenes. I think the behind the scenes stuff is what's really happening, the drama there. But if you demoted someone from talk A to talk B because of any reason at your conference, actually, if you would have told me, hey, I know I sold you a keynote, but like I need to drop you to this because your topic is just not quite what we need. I'd be like, I understand. I wouldn't be happy necessarily, but I don't know. I just get sounds like there's Rust leadership. There was a conference, and obviously, like project leadership and conference leadership are not always on the same page, about things in
Well,
the
I mean, I can
ecosystem.
tell you without getting into the soap opera of it, I think the core problem
Yeah,
for us in that is that there's the Rust Foundation, there's the Rust
yeah,
Project, and then there's Rust Conf, and they're all separate
yeah,
but related.
I
In
mean,
our, I mean, if you're
Postgres has
talking about,
similar issues, right?
yeah, certainly, but I mean,
Yeah,
PostgreSConf, the difference with PostgreSConf is if we sell you a keynote, you're getting a keynote.
yeah, yeah,
I mean that, and if you are given a keynote like with Leah or Lita, right? We're not going to demote you without talking to you ahead of time, right? I think the issue,
sure,
the reason people exploded in this other issue is that it happened. It wasn't Russ Kampf going to this guy and saying, "Hey, can we talk about how we can make this work because of
yeah,
whatever?" Right? It was like all of a
yeah,
sudden it was demoted, and then he was let know, right? Which is just
yeah,
bad form.
yeah, yeah. I agree.
But
I agree.
but my concern isn't that so much. My concern is there seems to be a pattern of the Rust project leadership creating a sense of instability within that technology. And that to me is the
Yeah,
bigger concern.
yeah. I'll check into it. I'll check into it. I personally just, yeah, we've been kind of not connected at the high level to. We're just users,
Sure.
just users. We're not involved at all at the high level there. So, but it's a good point. I mean, I think it's a tricky thing to deal with across these technical, like again, a lot of technologies have been beset by like drama, at
Hmm.
their conference and all that kind of stuff. And I think that, well, hopefully we can, like I said, I don't think Rust as an idea is going to go away, just because it seems to be doing well, if it's a different project, a spin-off project that's got better leadership, I'm happy to switch to that if it wins,
Sure.
but I think for me, like we're moving so fast that like that stuff happens. I just feel like like you said, over years. Even like MySQL, like the demise of MySQL versus Postgres, it just seemed to me like was very slow motion. I don't know if it felt slow motion to you, but
Well, I
from an
mean,
outsider's point
to
of
me,
view,
my sequel was never even a player, right? It's not about you.
yeah,
For me, I don't care if MySQL has 10 times the number of installed users, right? I care about how are
yeah,
those users being taken care of and how is their data being represented in terms of security, asset compliance, and all that.
yeah,
So to me, MySQL was never even a player in my space, right? It's
yeah,
just kind of a different thing.
yeah. Well, to like
Um,
the ORM users of the world, though, like if I'm just an ORM, I use a generic transactional database behind it. It used to be like, MySQL or Postgres,
sure.
most things supported both, but somehow just over time, and again, like I didn't really understand it until I came to Postgres, how much like MySQL has been dropping, but it's just been years and years and years of that slowly, not fast, because as far as I know, there could be more MySQL instances in the world than there are Postgres. I don't know if anyone knows what the answer is there, but
I don't think
I
there's any
have
way
to
to
think,
tell at this point, you know.
yeah,
I mean, if you
but
think
it
about
seems
it
like
this way, there
Postgres
is
is
one
definitely,
there is one thing, right? The number one installed software in the world is what? It's WordPress. WordPress supports MySQL, not Postgres.
yeah, that's right.
So
Therefore,
there is that.
it's got a bunch there. Yeah,
I got a
yeah,
couple final questions, and then we'll wrap this up. The Postgres ecosystem has ebbed and flowed and come and gone for well since 1997. Uh, who do you think is going to lead the charge? I mean, obviously actually, I'm not. I don't want to put ideas. Who do you think is going to lead the charge of Postgres development in the future?
I don't know. I've got. You're saying like which organizations are going to have the most committers? Is
Well,
that what you
yeah,
mean by
because
leading the
it
charge?
or at least
Yeah,
patch submitters, right? Because it's the people that are attributing
yeah,
the code that are going to
yeah,
ultimately determine the direction of the code.
yeah. I'm just not connected enough to have a perspective there, I kind of like the fact that right now it feels like, well, I'll tell you, like in Astronomer's case with Airflow, we ended up having say 20 of the top 40 contributors to Airflow were working it from our company because we were paying people to do it, right? Like so, in the Postgres, I don't know what percentage of committers are getting paid to do it, but it's probably, is it all of them? Would you say? Like,
It's
is there
it,
anyone
it
who's unpaid?
it's darn near close to all of them.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, I don't know. Who's the highest bidder then? I guess for their talents, it might be the question. Like,
Well, that's
um,
an interesting
I,
problem. So let's take Crunchy for example. Crunchy had
yeah,
a lot of committers. Amazon came in and said, "We'll pay you more." And now Amazon
yeah,
has almost all of those committers. They
yeah,
even took some from Microsoft. Amazon is very quickly, I mean, outside of Enterprise DB, Amazon, I wouldn't
yeah,
be surprised if in the next 3 years, Amazon is the number one contributor to PostgreSQL.org,
yeah,
just because they have the capital. Right now, there are other companies that have the capital, but those other companies haven't shown, I guess, a desire or a want to be that involved.
yeah.
Right. Whereas,
Well, I think, yeah. I was gonna say, like, to me, I mean, there's not so EDB or I don't know, Crunchy is VC backed, aren't they? They're not like
oh yeah,
they're
they're
maybe they're later
absolutely VC backed.
stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But they can't give people a ton of equity now. Later stage VC backed companies can't really um, give what a company like ours could do. Like I could, for example, I guess this is my opportunity to pitch the committers, but like, I can give you a good chunk of Tembo. If you're a committer that wants to come work with me, I can give you a big piece of this company and it vests over 4 years, and um, if we're successful, you get to really have a big outcome, in
Right.
addition to whatever your salary may be. And so, like, I think we can attract some people like that. So I'm going to say, who's going to own them in the future? It's going to be the big three cloud or startups, that have equity that they can try to. Again, the real question is: are these people tempted or interested in working hard for equity and all this kind of stuff? Like, we'll see. I think a few could be, hopefully will be, yeah. But I think mostly it's going to be the big clouds, the big companies. It's a bidding war, and but I'm willing to pay a lot for committers, just like, um, you know, well, our CTO just came from Microsoft, so we were able to reverse that trend, I guess, of people going to the big clouds, but maybe Microsoft's losing a bunch of them. I'm not sure.
Well, that's an interesting point. Is that, and I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. I mean, from my perspective, I would much prefer to see, you know, 250, 20 to 50 person companies working together for the greater good of Postgres,
Yeah,
versus Postgres being driven by, essentially, right now the majority of Postgres is driven by EDB, Fujitsu,
yeah,
Crunchy, and Amazon. I mean, and that represents probably a 70% of the development, right? If not more.
yeah, hmm,
And it's not that that's a bad thing. There's actually some good to come with that because you can move a little faster. But on the other
yeah,
hand, we are in it. It used to be. Well, I mean, a good example is, back when you were building your web company, right? And ISPs, there used to be thousands
hmm,
of ISPs, right?
yeah,
Thousands. Now there's
yep,
essentially two. Your ISP is either
yeah,
Starlink or your cable company, generally speaking,
right.
right?
That's right. Yeah,
Um, so, and I don't know that that's a good thing. I think that hampers the ability for people to truly experience what Postgres could be,
yeah.
if it was a wider distribution of people building this thing.
Yeah, and that's why. So to me, I'm basically thinking of it as a second ring. So I'm thinking, I guess let's take Saturn as an example. You got Postgres as the core, but there's these interesting rings around it. What are they? What are they made of? Are they valuable? So I think if you take those rings in aggregate, that to me is an opportunity that we're going to try to leverage, and try to support. And like I said, if we can make it onto the planet someday, great. If not, there's a lot of work to be done out there. There's a lot of open source work in Postgres that isn't in the core,
Oh,
and I don't know how
absolutely.
many if we like talked total commits, across the core versus the non-core community projects, it's probably more math on the outside. I'll have to do some math to figure that out because I've got a big database of these projects. But yeah, I mean, it's that's why I'm excited about like getting involved and trying to help organize the community projects in Postgres.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Some of the most interesting things, and this is due to what Postgres has done. So I don't want to take away from
Yeah,
PostgreSQL.org's work, but the most interesting things that are happening now with PostgreSQL have nothing to do with PostgreSQL.org,
yeah, that's right.
right?
But
Between all the
you know,
extensions, and I mean, between Citus and PG Vector and even other ones
yeah,
that you wouldn't even think about, like PG Repack, right? I mean, there's just some really good stuff out there if you know where to find it. That might be
right.
kind of where you're coming from.
Yes,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
all right. Well,
Like I said, I want to collect some stats on that. Yeah. So yeah.
is there anything you'd like to share before we wrap this up?
No, I just appreciate you having me on, and yeah, it's been a nice conversation.
All right, great. Well, with that, this has been More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest was Rye Walker with Tembo. Check it out. Thanks a lot.